They called me to help, not to my face, of course, but just loud enough that I could hear it echo in the hallway. I was 24, broke, and taking care of 3 children who lived in a house with 4 bathrooms. Their mothers would glance at me over wine glasses, speaking in polished sarcasm. "Oh, how nice that she reads to them. It's so sweet when they think they matter." But I kept reading, and when the kids fell asleep, I kept studying. I didn't answer back. I didn't have the words yet. But 10 years later, I didn't need them. Because one morning, those same mothers sat in a crowded auditorium, and my name was the one printed on the welcome banner: founder, executive director, owner. The school their children now attend, the one with the waiting list and press coverage, belonged to me. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated. At 24, I stepped into a world that wasn't mine. The front door alone was taller than any doorway I'd ever walked through. It closed behind me with a kind of softness that only money can afford. No creak, no slam, just a hush like even the house didn't want to disturb the quiet. My shoes clicked against polished floors. Light poured in through windows the size of billboards. There was a smell in the air, lemons and luxury, and for a moment, I felt like I shouldn't breathe too deeply. They called it just a nanny job. But to me, it was survival. I had lost my scholarship the year before, when I couldn't cover the fees that weren't covered by aid, things like lab materials, transport, late tuition penalties. I had been working 2 jobs just to eat. When the offer came in, full-time live-in childcare with meals and housing, it sounded like stability. It sounded like maybe I'd have space to think. I didn't know yet how small it would make me feel. The family had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, all under 8. They were beautiful and loud and messy and smarter than their parents gave them credit for. I liked them immediately. I didn't like the way their mother introduced me at dinner parties like I was a feature of the house, somewhere between the caterer and the pool. She said my name like it was a hobby. Her friends never made eye contact. They called me sweet. They called me helpful. They never called me capable. I learned to shrink into corners, to listen without reacting, to clean up without being seen. I learned which shoes made no sound on tile, and how to smile when the children's grandmother made comments about girls like you getting too comfortable in other people's homes. I learned not to flinch when a mother of another child at school assumed I was the cleaning lady. I learned to sit with it. The house had 4 bathrooms. I only used one, the one closest to the laundry room, the one without a window. I folded towels in silence, washed tiny socks that cost more than my entire closet, cooked meals from laminated meal plans, and in between, I read. I kept my textbooks under the bed. I borrowed library cards from friends. At night, after bedtime stories and sleep schedules, I'd climb into bed and open my laptop to PDFs on child development and early literacy. I took notes in the dark. I memorized lesson plans like they were prayers. No one knew. No one asked. To them, I was just the nanny. I kept my head down, I kept the schedule. But something about the way they looked at me, that fixed, frozen pity mixed with superiority, it stuck. It made me press harder into the idea that I didn't belong there forever, that I wasn't supposed to orbit other people's children for the rest of my life while they got credit for being involved parents. One afternoon, I overheard one of the moms, well-dressed, sun-kissed, always carrying a leather planner, laughing in the foyer. She gestured toward me as I passed and said something like, "It's adorable how she reads to them like it's going to matter." They all laughed. Even the homeowner. No one corrected her. That night, I cried in the supply closet. I didn't make a sound. I just let my face go soft and still and let the tears fall. I remember staring at the shelf of folded sheets, thinking, these people are raising the future. and I'm raising their kids. But I didn't quit. I stayed. I stayed long enough to learn what kind of education the rich were buying for their children. I watched the schools they applied to. I listened to what they valued: test scores, exclusivity, the illusion of progressiveness. I filed it all away like evidence. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it, but I knew it was mine. Quietly, I was building a blueprint. They had 4 bathrooms. I had 1 laptop. But I was the only one in that house, studying every night. And someday, they were going to find out what I'd been studying for. I used to walk past the university campus on my days off, just to remind myself what it looked like. The brick buildings, the ivy-covered arches, the students with earbuds and backpacks, who had no idea how lucky they were. I'd glance at the flyers posted on bulletin boards, tutoring sessions, seminars, study abroad trips, and wonder what it would feel like to belong in a place like that. To enter a lecture hall and not feel like I had to earn my way into every seat. I wanted that degree so badly I could taste it. Not for the paper, not even for the title. I wanted the freedom it represented. I wanted to be taken seriously. I had been accepted into the early childhood education program the year before I became a nanny. The acceptance letter came with an asterisk, partial funding, limited aid, and a list of hidden costs that added up fast. The school had offered hope, but not help. My savings were gone within weeks. After 1 semester, I was already behind on payments. I remember the sick feeling of checking my account balance and realizing that I had to make a choice. Keep pretending I could afford to keep up, or pause before I sank deeper into debt. I paused. I told myself it was temporary. 1 semester off. Maybe 2. I'd work, save, re-enroll. But time didn't slow down to wait for me. It just moved forward, and I moved with it into a job, into a room over someone's garage, into responsibilities that didn't come with any credentials. At night, when the kids I cared for were asleep and the house was dark, I'd open my laptop and read the same course syllabi I couldn't officially access anymore. I found open-source versions of textbooks, sat through YouTube lectures, took notes like I had a final exam coming. I wasn't earning credits, but I was learning. Quietly, in secret. It hurt to see people breeze through the system I had been pushed out of. Girls from my high school who had never even liked children were posting about their internships in classrooms. They wore lanyards with school district logos and smiled in photos next to bulletin boards they didn't make themselves. I watched from a distance, not out of jealousy, but from a place of knowing I was already doing the work. I just didn't have the right label for it. I considered going back more times than I could count. I filled out FAFSA forms late at night. I refreshed scholarship databases. I wrote emails to advisors that I never sent, but every time I calculated the gap between what I had and what I needed, the number was too big. And still, I refused to stop studying. I wasn't willing to let go of the dream just because I couldn't afford the price tag. So I built my own curriculum. I shadowed teachers when I could, volunteered at public libraries, read educational research like it was gospel. I learned to analyze lesson plans, write behavioral objectives, and create literacy scaffolding, all without a classroom or a cohort. And every once in a while, I'd be reminded of the gap between their world and mine. A mother would tell me about the new tutor she'd hired for her 5-year-old. A father would complain about how hard it is to find good help these days. I wasn't part of their conversations. I was their background. The young woman who made dinner appear and tantrums disappear. But while they watched their children from a distance, I was studying every move up close. I saw how kids learned, how they responded to praise or pressure, how their personalities bloomed when no one was looking. That house was my classroom, and those children were the reason I kept pushing forward. I still couldn't afford the degree, but I could afford something more valuable: persistence. I was slowly building what I needed, brick by invisible brick. The credits weren't on a transcript. The accomplishments weren't posted online. But the work was real, and deep down, I knew something they didn't. You don't need permission to become educated. You don't even need a desk. You just need hunger. And I had that in abundance. The kitchen table became my campus. It wasn't made of oak or mahogany. It was a dented IKEA surface, scarred with years of sippy cups and sticky cereal spoons, tucked in a corner near the back window where the kids did their homework. But every night, after dishes were done and backpacks were zipped, I would sit there alone, open my secondhand laptop, and turn it into something else entirely. That table saw more of my effort than any classroom ever had. It knew my frustration, my exhaustion, my drive. I used to light a single lamp so the glow wouldn't spill into the hallway. It became my ritual. Clear the crumbs, wipe down the plastic surface, open the browser, and pick up where I left off. I found entire courses online, some free, some paid in tiny installments. Not accredited, but credible. Video lectures, slide decks, forums full of teachers and aides sharing strategies and frustrations. I watched lessons on early childhood development with a notebook in one hand and a cup of tea in the other. I took notes like I was preparing for a test no one would ever give me. It didn't matter. I gave it to myself. Every week I picked a topic and treated it like a syllabus. Phonics, sensory learning, behavior modeling, differentiated instruction. I created imaginary lesson plans, filled them with activities tailored to kids. I already knew what would work for Emma, what might calm Jordan, how I'd help twins who never stopped interrupting each other. I wasn't fantasizing, I was practicing. There were nights I fell asleep with my head on the table, nights I didn't understand the material and had to rewind the same 5 minutes of a lecture 3 times. Nights I wondered if it would ever amount to anything more than silent preparation. But I never stopped. Sometimes, during the day, I'd test out what I learned. I'd build sensory boxes for the toddler, use pattern games to teach numbers to the middle child. I'd see what made them light up and what bored them instantly. I began documenting everything in a spreadsheet I kept hidden in a folder labeled groceries. Just in case someone ever checked. I didn't want pity. I didn't want anyone to pat me on the back for trying so hard. I wanted results. I wanted to know that if the moment ever came, if I ever got the chance to build something of my own, I wouldn't freeze. I'd be ready. On Sundays, while the family went to brunch, I printed out free materials from teachers' blogs. I kept binders of resources, quotes, research summaries. I created a curriculum map just to see if I could. No one saw any of it. They just saw the nanny who washed dishes and picked up Legos. But at night, I sat at that table like it was a desk in the corner office of my own private institution. I gave myself deadlines. I scheduled mock meetings. I designed my own feedback sheets. I started tracking learning outcomes. The youngest child had started recognizing letters earlier than expected. The middle child became less anxious during transitions. The oldest began asking deeper questions about books. I didn't take credit, but I noted every shift. It was working. I wasn't just learning theory, I was testing it in the wild. And the kitchen table, with all its chipped paint and wobbly legs, had become the center of something that no one could see yet. A degree in progress. A vision forming. Some people go to campus for 4 years. I went to work every morning and to class every night without leaving the same 4 walls. It wasn't prestigious, it wasn't photogenic, but it was mine. And it was real. And someday, I was going to use it to build a place where kids and their caregivers were seen for what they could become, not where they came from. It happened on a Saturday. Late afternoon, spring sunlight flooding through the living room windows, the kind of warm, quiet lull between the chaos of morning routines and the frenzy of bedtime. The children were outside playing in the backyard, their laughter drifting faintly through the screen door. and I was gathering half-colored worksheets off the coffee table before they disappeared under the furniture again. The mothers were all there, gathered around the kitchen island with glasses of something cold and expensive, their voices low and glossy with confidence. I hadn't meant to linger. I usually made myself invisible during these gatherings, floating between the kids and the crumbs, in and out of earshot without being noticed. But that day, one of the mothers waved vaguely in my direction, mid-sentence, without even glancing up from her story. I paused in the archway, half turning back to the hallway, just in time to hear the punchline. "She's just the nanny," she said. The room laughed. Not loud, not cruel, just casually amused. Like it was the most obvious truth in the world. Something in my chest locked. The woman who'd said it had perfect hair and perfect teeth, and a husband who only ever spoke about flights and markets and margins, she didn't mean it as an insult. That's what stung the most. It wasn't meant to hurt me. It wasn't even about me. It was a punctuation mark in a conversation that didn't require my presence or my opinion. I wasn't a person to them. I was context. I was a convenience. I smiled. I always smiled. And I turned back toward the hallway, climbed the stairs, and sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room they called mine. The door was closed. My hands were still holding the papers I'd picked up downstairs. I stared at the worksheet with crooked crayon lines and phonics scribbled in the margins, and felt this unbearable stillness press in on me. Just the nanny. The phrase looped in my head like a cruel lullaby. Not a teacher, not a student, not a leader, not someone building something, just the nanny. I thought about every night I spent at that kitchen table, every lecture I watched on a cracked screen, every notebook page full of ideas I'd never shared with anyone. I thought about how much I knew, how deeply I cared, how hard I was trying, and how none of it mattered if people only ever saw me as a warm body to keep their children occupied. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I sat there and let the words harden into something cold and sharp inside me. That was the moment something shifted. Not the kind of shift people notice. It wasn't dramatic. I still made lunch. I still picked up toys. I still folded laundry and read bedtime stories and packed backpacks. But my posture changed. My silence got heavier. I stopped waiting to be seen. I started making plans they'd never be invited to. That comment, those 4 little words, did something no diploma or certificate ever could. They clarified my purpose. They taught me exactly how the world saw me and exactly how I would make them regret it. Because I wasn't just anything. I was temporary. I was observing. I was building. And someday, those same women would walk into a room they'd paid to be in, sit down in front of a microphone, and hear my name announced. Not as the help, but as the owner, as the expert, as the woman who'd taken every condescending smile and turned it into an empire. I didn't slam the door on my way out. There was no dramatic goodbye, no bitter final conversation, no parting monologue about being undervalued or overlooked. That wasn't my style, and more importantly, it wouldn't have mattered. They wouldn't have heard me even if I'd shouted. So I left quietly. I gave the required 2 weeks' notice, phrased in the most polite and digestible terms possible. Pursuing another opportunity, I wrote, knowing full well they wouldn't ask what kind. In their world, people like me didn't have opportunities. We had errands, we had side gigs. We had vague ambitions that never really materialized into anything real. Their reaction confirmed it. The mother tilted her head and said, "Well, that's a shame. The kids really love you," like I was a favorite toy that had broken. The father gave me a handshake and asked if I had something lined up. I smiled and said yes. They didn't ask where. They didn't ask why. Because to them, I was rotating staff, a role to be refilled. They were already asking around before I'd even packed my things. The kids took it harder. They didn't understand. I didn't want them to. I told them I'd be going on a big adventure and that I'd always be cheering them on from wherever I ended up. They hugged me like it meant forever. And, in a way, it did. On my final day, I cleaned the playroom one last time. I lined up the books, folded the tiny sweaters, and placed one note for each child under their pillows. I didn't sign them with my name. I just wrote what I hoped someone would say to me if the roles were reversed. You're smart. You matter. I believe in you. I left before they got home. I didn't want to hear another round of polite dismissal. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of one last smile. I didn't want to answer more questions that weren't really questions, just statements disguised as concern. Instead, I walked out the back door, past the same lawn where I'd once spent whole afternoons running sprinkler games and cleaning scraped knees. I passed the garden where I'd taught the youngest how to count tomato plants. I paused in the driveway for just a second, looking back, not at the house, but at the life I had lived within it. And then I got in my car and drove away. It was a short ride to my new place, a one-bedroom sublet, over a dental office with bad insulation and a view of a parking lot. But it was mine. The rent was cheap, the Wi-Fi was reliable, and for the first time in years, I had space. Not just physical space, but mental space. I unpacked the few boxes I'd brought and set up my books in neat rows. My laptop went on the kitchen counter, a cheap corkboard above it. That night, I made myself dinner and ate it on the floor. And then I did what I always did. I opened my computer, clicked play on a new module, and took notes. Only this time, it felt different. Because now, I wasn't doing it in someone else's house, under someone else's roof, beneath someone else's expectations. I was doing it on my own terms. Leaving quietly doesn't mean leaving weak. It means knowing when to save your energy for something greater. I didn't need to prove anything to them. They weren't my audience. My future students were. And someday, they'd walk through a door with my name on it. Not as a nanny, not as a caretaker, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had built something that lasted. From the outside, it looked like a resignation, but from the inside, it was a beginning, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but builds in silence, like roots under concrete. And I was done asking for sunlight. I was growing upward whether they saw it or not. My first classroom wasn't mine. It belonged to a woman named Miss Chen, a veteran teacher with 30 years of experience, and the calm, sharp presence of someone who had seen everything and still showed up every morning. I was assigned to her room during my practicum semester at a public charter school downtown. The desks were chipped, the walls covered in peeling laminated posters, the air thick with the scent of dry erase markers and leftover lunch trays. But to me, it felt like a cathedral. I had no real title yet, just student aide on the paperwork, but every moment in that room felt like something sacred. I arrived early, stayed late, and asked questions even when I was afraid of sounding foolish. Miss Chen didn't coddle, she didn't sugarcoat, but she saw me. She saw that I was more than eager, I was serious. And seriousness, in this work, was everything. I filed worksheets. I graded spelling tests. I organized reading corners and reset behavior charts. But more importantly, I watched. I paid attention to how Miss Chen managed the mood of the room without raising her voice. How she translated chaos into structure with nothing but a glance. How she responded to setbacks like they were part of the lesson. The students didn't know my name at first. Some called me Miss. Some called me teacher. Others ignored me completely. But I learned their routines, their quirks, the way one of them always chewed on his sleeve when he got nervous, and how another needed extra time after recess to come down from the noise. Slowly, they started to look for me when they had questions. Outside the classroom, I worked in cafeterias and staff lounges, taking shifts to make ends meet. I served pizza slices with plastic gloves and wiped down sticky tables while teachers graded papers and joked about quitting. No one knew I was in school, too. No one asked. They saw the apron, the tray, and assumed I belonged in the background. That dual existence, teacher in training by day, cafeteria staff by afternoon, taught me more than any textbook ever could. I learned about hierarchy. I learned about exhaustion. I learned how schools functioned not just on curriculum, but on invisible labor, the janitors, the aides, the after-school volunteers. And I watched how easily those people were overlooked. I knew I wouldn't stay in those roles forever. But while I was there, I treated them like training grounds. Every lunch duty was a study in social dynamics. Every hallway interaction was a rehearsal in presence and posture. I didn't just want to teach, I wanted to lead. And to lead, I needed to understand the system from the bottom up. One day, a teacher called out sick, and the office was scrambling to find coverage. I offered to step in, just for the day. The secretary hesitated, unsure if it was even allowed, but there was no one else. I walked into that second-grade classroom with a printed math packet and a whiteboard marker and tried not to show how fast my heart was beating. It went well, not perfectly, but better than I expected. The kids listened. I kept order. We even laughed once or twice. When the teacher returned the next day, the students asked if I was coming back. That was the moment I knew I was more than background. I was capable. It wasn't glamorous. I still went home with chalk dust on my sleeves and cafeteria grease on my shoes. But I was building credibility, 1 hour at a time. By the end of the semester, Miss Chen wrote me a reference letter that I've kept to this day. In it, she didn't mention my test scores or attendance. She wrote that I had presence, that I was the kind of person who made classrooms better by being in them. It was the first time someone in the field put into words what I had always hoped was true, that I wasn't just learning how to teach, I was becoming someone worth learning from. It happened during recess, the kind of ordinary day you forget. In every other way, the sky was cloudy, the blacktop still damp from a morning drizzle, the air thick with shouts and sneakers and laughter. I stood near the fence, clipboard in hand, doing what aides always did, watching, keeping track of who needed a bandage, who wasn't sharing, who was about to throw a ball too hard. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. And then I saw it. A little girl, curly-haired, quiet, was sitting alone under the jungle gym, tracing the edge of her shoe into the dirt. She wasn't crying. She wasn't even upset. She was just somewhere else entirely, invisible to the dozens of bodies racing past her. I recognized the look on her face because I'd worn it myself at that age. Not lonely, not angry, just outside of everything. I walked toward her slowly, crouched beside her without saying a word, and handed her a piece of sidewalk chalk. She didn't ask what to do with it. She just took it, stood up, and began to draw on the blacktop. First lines, then shapes, then a bright pink sun with impossible rays stretching to the edge of the asphalt. It hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, kneeling beside her, watching the world she made, something broke open inside me. Not just a longing, not just a memory. A realization. I didn't want to be in other people's classrooms forever. I didn't want to spend my life following someone else's rules about how children should learn, how they should behave, what they should become. I wanted something else. I wanted to build a place where children didn't have to earn safety or visibility. A space where being quiet wasn't treated like a problem to fix. Where creative kids weren't sidelined, and busy kids weren't punished for energy. A school that wasn't obsessed with scores, prestige, or performance. A school that looked at a child and saw potential before profile. I didn't know exactly what it would look like. I didn't know how I'd pay for it, or where I'd build it, or what hoops I'd have to jump through. But the vision was clear. I wanted to create an environment that reimagined what learning felt like for students, for teachers, for everyone in the building. That day, after recess, I wrote down everything I could remember about the feeling. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. It was too fragile, too private. But it was mine. Over the next few months, that vision stopped being a fantasy and started becoming a blueprint. I started researching school models, Montessori, Reggio Emilia, project-based learning. I took online courses in education policy, facility planning, child psychology. I started sketching floor plans in the margins of my notebooks. Open spaces, breakout corners, natural light. I imagined classrooms with rugs instead of rows, teachers with time to breathe, students with room to explore. And even though I was still working in borrowed spaces, wiping tables and tracking attendance, my mind was already somewhere else. I stopped looking at school buildings as institutions and started seeing them as prototypes. What worked? What failed? What could be done better? Every hallway conversation, every parent-teacher conference, every meltdown at lunchtime, it all became data. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was observing, strategizing, preparing. People still saw me as an assistant, a helper, a nice girl with good instincts. No one saw what was coming, that I had a plan, that I was documenting everything, that I was quietly designing something bigger than myself. I didn't want a promotion. I didn't want to climb some broken internal ladder. I wanted my own building. And someday, that little girl who drew suns on pavement would walk into a classroom with her name on the wall, not as part of a quota or a statistic, but because she was seen. Because someone, once, had sat beside her and understood. And because that, someone had turned a recess shift into a revolution. I didn't announce anything. Not on social media, not to friends, not even to the people who probably would have supported me. I didn't want encouragement. I wanted focus. Praise was a distraction I couldn't afford, and explanations always invited skepticism. So I started building in silence. Quietly. Systematically. Like an architect sketching blueprints in the dark. I kept my day job, mornings in the classroom, afternoons supervising homework club, weekends helping with curriculum prep. Every spare hour that wasn't spoken for belonged to the project. At night, I pulled up grant databases and scrolled through eligibility requirements until my eyes blurred. I studied zoning laws. I taught myself how to read contracts. I watched interviews with founders of charter schools and micro schools and private academies. Most of them didn't look like me. That only made me more certain I needed to do it. I didn't even have a location yet. Just a name, a mission statement, and a vision so clear it kept me up at night. I bought a domain. I started outlining programs. I researched licensing. I learned how to register a nonprofit and how to form an LLC just in case I needed a hybrid model. The rules weren't friendly to first-timers, especially ones without big-name donors or board connections. But rules are just roadmaps for people who want permission. I wanted ownership. My apartment looked more like a planning bunker than a living space. Post-it notes on the walls, binders stacked like bricks, Google spreadsheets open on 3 tabs. My fridge was mostly coffee and leftovers. I forgot birthdays. I turned down invitations. I didn't feel guilty about any of it. Because every night I worked, I could feel something shifting inside me, a momentum that didn't need applause to keep going. Funding was the hardest part. I didn't come from money. I didn't know any investors. I pitched to local businesses, applied for community grants, cold emailed people with long bios and short attention spans. I got ignored more times than I can count. One woman told me my dream was noble but naive. I thanked her and added her to my mental guest list for opening day. Eventually, I found someone who believed in it. A retired principal who had spent 3 decades watching the system fail kids who didn't fit its mold. She read my proposal and asked me 2 questions. Do you have the stamina for this? And what will you do when people say no? I told her the truth. I'd already been told no 100 times, and I was still here. She wrote a check that didn't cover everything, but it opened the first door. I walked through it without hesitation. From there, it became real. A small space in a church basement became our pilot classroom. A few families from the after-school program took a chance and enrolled their kids. I hired 2 part-time teachers, one retired, one just starting out. We bought second-hand furniture, painted the walls ourselves, turned every square foot into a space with purpose. I used my nights to finalize policies, build lesson plans, and train staff. I used my mornings to teach like nothing had changed. No press, no ribbon cutting, just 26 kids, 2 adults, and a vision stronger than the noise around it. The silence wasn't just a necessity, it was a strategy. I didn't want to grow too fast or attract the wrong attention. I wanted to prove the model worked, that the idea wasn't just poetic, it was practical. Within 6 months, we had a wait list. Parents started talking. Kids who used to dread school were asking to come in early. Something was happening, and it had nothing to do with hype. Every step of the way, I thought about those women with perfect smiles and sharper words, the ones who never saw me as anything more than background. I didn't need to tell them what I was doing, because eventually they were going to find out the only way that mattered, from the outside looking in. And when they did, they wouldn't just see me. They'd see everything they missed while they were busy looking down. The ribbon was red, wide, and held in place by 2 students who had no idea just how much weight it carried. One of them kept fidgeting with the oversized scissors we'd borrowed from the local community center, while the other squinted at the crowd, forming behind the makeshift podium. It wasn't a grand stage, just a few folding chairs, a rented sound system, and a banner printed with our name. But to me, it might as well have been the steps at the Lincoln Center. The cameras weren't big media outlets. A couple of local education reporters, a parent with a DSLR, one news intern from a neighborhood blog who kept asking for quotes that would make the headline pop. I gave her the best I could. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was that this moment wasn't the beginning, it was the reveal. The beginning had happened years ago, in silence and sacrifice. This was just the curtain lifting. When I stood in front of the microphone, I could feel my knees shaking, not from nerves, but from the gravity of it. I looked out at a modest crowd, teachers, students, families, neighbors, a few city officials in suits they didn't quite fit into. And scattered among them, just close enough to notice, but far enough not to draw attention, were a few familiar faces. Mothers from years ago, ones who had tilted wine glasses while calling me just the nanny, ones whose children were now on our wait list. I didn't look at them for long. I didn't need to. My speech wasn't rehearsed. I spoke from the same place I'd spoken from every night at the kitchen table, and every morning in classrooms that weren't mine. I talked about dignity. I talked about curiosity. I talked about how education was never meant to be standardized, how children deserve spaces that see who they are before deciding what they should be. People clapped. Some even stood. I kept my face still, letting the applause roll over me like rain on a roof, heard, felt, but never fully absorbed. Because deep down, I wasn't celebrating, I was confirming. This was not a reward. This was alignment. The world was finally catching up to what I had known in my gut for years. When it came time for the ribbon, I didn't take the scissors myself. I handed them to one of the students, a girl with quiet eyes and a relentless love of puzzles. She was the kind of child who would have disappeared in a larger classroom. Here, she was thriving. She cut the ribbon without hesitation. and the moment the ends fluttered to the ground, the crowd erupted in cheers. I heard my name called from the crowd, first by a parent, then a journalist, then in a chant started by students. I smiled, but again, not for the noise. I smiled because I had built something that didn't need defending. A place that spoke for itself. After the ceremony, people lingered. They took photos by the entrance. They peeked into the classrooms we'd poured ourselves into. I watched from the side, arms crossed, heart steady. One of the mothers who used to call me sweet approached with her husband. She was holding a program, flipping it over like she couldn't quite believe what she was reading. "This is yours?" she asked. I nodded. She didn't say anything else, just nodded back, awkward and slow, then turned away. That was all I needed. Not applause, not validation, just recognition, not for my sake but for hers. Because now, she knew, now they all did. The woman they'd once dismissed as background was now the name on the wall, the founder on the podium, the force behind the system their children had to apply to enter. The cameras kept flashing, kids ran in circles near the playground, reporters asked for follow-ups. And somewhere between the end of the ceremony and the start of cleanup, I stood in the middle of it, all unbothered, unmoved, completely whole. The ribbon had been cut, but what it symbolized was sewn into everything we'd built, and no one could take that apart. It started slowly, like everything else in my life. One phone call, then two. A few email inquiries asking if we were enrolling mid-year. Parents heard about us through word of mouth, mostly from other parents. The kind who whispered in pickup lines or swapped recommendations at yoga class. I didn't think much of it at first, but then the calls didn't stop. They multiplied. They came from outside the district, outside the city, from families who were tired of rigidity, test scores, and classrooms where their kids were numbers instead of names. I created a spreadsheet to track it all at first, just to stay organized. I color-coded by grade level, added a few columns for contact details, dates of inquiry, and notes on what the parents were looking for. Some wanted smaller class sizes. Some wanted a curriculum that respected their child's unique pace. Some were just desperate, disillusioned, and out of options. Then, something strange happened. One night, scrolling through the newest entries, I saw a name that made me pause. It wasn't the child's name, it was the parents'. A last name I hadn't thought about in years. One of the mothers from that perfect house with 4 bathrooms. The kind of woman who used to offer me her empty wine glass instead of eye contact. I double-checked the form. There was no mistake. She'd submitted an application to our school. Her child was entering 3rd grade. The note she left said simply, "Seeking a progressive, emotionally supportive learning environment." I sat back and stared at the screen, a strange mix of disbelief and deep, quiet satisfaction washing over me. I didn't delete the entry. I didn't flag it or highlight it. I just let it sit there like all the others. A name and a line on a list, waiting for its turn. Within weeks, the list doubled, then tripled. Our staff couldn't keep up with the calls. I hired an admissions coordinator, then a second teacher. We expanded into an unused wing of the church building we rented. A community grant helped us buy new furniture, fresh paint, brighter lights. We hosted open houses, and they filled up fast. The sign-up forms closed within hours, but still, the names kept coming. The waiting list became its own kind of statement. Not a gimmick, not a marketing tool. A symbol. Proof that what we'd created filled a gap no one else had noticed, or worse, no one else had cared about. Parents were willing to wait 6 months, a year, even 2, just to be part of it. It was never about exclusivity. That was never the point. I didn't want to create another elite space that shut people out. But when demand outpaced capacity, I had to make decisions. And those decisions told a story. Some of the same families who once assumed I was beneath them now sat across from me in parent interviews. They didn't recognize me, at least not right away. Time had passed. I was no longer wearing an apron or wiping jam off their kids' faces. I wore tailored jackets now. I held a clipboard, not a diaper bag. And when I said our school or our philosophy, I meant it. One of them blinked when I introduced myself, her lips parting in slow realization. She didn't say anything, but I saw the flicker. I saw the moment her brain connected the dots and realized that the woman she once called just the nanny now held the keys to her child's education. I didn't gloat. I didn't twist the knife. That wasn't the point. The victory wasn't in turning them away. It was in the fact that they came to me at all, that they recognized value, even if they didn't know its origin. The waiting list kept growing. We added a second location, hired more staff, created a scholarship fund for families who couldn't afford full tuition. I made sure the mission never wavered, a space where every child was seen, where quiet wasn't punished and difference wasn't pathologized. But behind the operations, the meetings, the expansion plans, there was always that spreadsheet, still color-coded, still growing, and every time I updated it, I felt the same steady pulse of clarity. They used to overlook me. Now they're waiting for me, and no matter how long that list became, I never forgot how it started with one girl tracing chalk lines into the pavement and one woman building a revolution from the kitchen table. Orientation Day was always my favorite part of the school year. It wasn't just a new beginning for the children, it was a ceremony of arrival for the families, a day when the abstract idea of our school became tangible. There was something sacred in watching nervous parents grip coffee cups, while their children clutched brand new backpacks and stared wide-eyed at classrooms filled with bean bags, art supplies, and shelves lined with books rather than standardized charts. We didn't decorate with achievement graphs or behavioral trackers. We decorated with stories. The walls told children they belonged here before anyone had to say it. That year's orientation day was different, bigger, more organized. Our enrollment had doubled, the staff had grown, and the operations ran like a machine. But I still showed up early, as I always did, before the sun fully crested the rooftops. I walked the halls in silence, taking it all in the freshly sharpened pencils, the scuff-free floors, the name tags waiting patiently on every desk. The smell of possibility was real. I inhaled it like oxygen. By 8:30 a.m., the lobby filled with families. The energy was a blend of cautious excitement and polite anxiety. People arrived, dressed for their first impressions. Mothers in pressed linen, fathers pretending not to be nervous, children toggling between eagerness and clinginess. I stood near the front, greeting them one by one. Some knew who I was, others didn't, which I didn't mind. Titles weren't why I did this. Then I saw her. One of the mothers from the house with the endless staircase and designer wallpaper. She hadn't aged much, still polished, still precise, still exuding that crisp suburban veneer that could cut paper. She held her son's hand, her fingers curled so tightly around his that he winced, and then her eyes met mine. She recognized me instantly. I watched it happen, the shift in her pupils, the flicker of disbelief. The moment memory outpaced logic, and she realized who I was. Her mouth opened slightly, not in greeting but in stunned silence. I smiled warmly, the same way I always did. She stepped forward as though drawn by some unspoken rule. Her son was scanning the room, clearly unaware of the weight his mother now carried. She said my name tentatively, softly, like it wasn't sure it belonged in her mouth. I confirmed it with a nod. There was no apology, no backpedaling, just a slight adjustment in posture, a sudden stiffness in her shoulders, and a look I had come to know intimately over the years. Recalibration. She was adjusting her internal framework, revising the story she'd told herself about who I was. The woman she once called help now stood at the center of a space she couldn't control. I didn't indulge the moment. I pointed her toward the auditorium, where the welcome session would begin. She thanked me too formally, too fast, and hurried along. Her son tugged at her sleeve and asked something about snacks. Inside the auditorium, I took the mic and addressed the crowd the way I always did, without grandeur, but with certainty. I told them who we were, what we believed. I reminded them that this was not a school built on pressure or perfection, but on dignity, imagination, and care. I told them their children would not be turned into products here. They would be listened to, seen, challenged, and protected. There was applause, a few tears. Someone even stood. I caught her glance again from the fourth row. She was still trying to process what the room already knew. This was mine. After the presentation, parents scattered to tour the classrooms. Staff members led them through reading corners, outdoor play areas, lunchrooms filled with round tables and open space. The kids lit up. You could feel it, the excitement that only comes when a child senses they're about to be free. As I stood by the doorway to the kindergarten room, I felt a tap on my arm. It was her again. She didn't say much. Just a quiet, "This place, it's special." And then she added, without looking me in the eye, "We're lucky to be here." I didn't respond right away. There was nothing to correct. No need to revisit the past. The acknowledgement was subtle, imperfect, but it was there. So I just nodded, because the truth was, she was lucky. Not because I had succeeded, but because her son would learn in a space built by someone who once knelt on cold kitchen tiles, washing dishes no one thanked her for, and dreaming of a school where every child, every single one, felt like they belonged. Even the ones whose parents had once looked right through me. Especially them. Parent-teacher night always started the same way: warm lighting, soft music playing in the background, stacks of student work displayed proudly on the tables, and teachers rehearsing their talking points behind closed doors. It had a ritualistic feel, as if every folder handed out and every chair angled just right was part of something sacred. I never wanted it to feel corporate. This wasn't a showcase for grades or a parade of inflated compliments. This was about connection. About showing families what we saw when we looked at their children beyond numbers, beyond performance, beyond pressure. I always made a point to stand in the center atrium, not as an administrator behind a desk, but as a host in her home. Parents would trickle in, some clutching notepads, some balancing toddlers on their hips, some walking in cautiously, unsure of what to expect. I welcomed each of them with a quiet confidence I had earned through years of being underestimated, and in those small conversations, I could feel it. They knew this wasn't like the other schools. The night was going smoothly. Smiles, introductions, moments of shared pride. A father told me his son had never felt smart before. A mother said her daughter finally loved coming to class. A grandmother squeezed my hand and said, "You see them. You really see them." I nodded, because I did. That was the whole point. Then I saw her. She entered with the same posture she always had, upright, elegant, rehearsed. The mother from my nanny days. The one who once laughed behind wine glasses and corrected my grammar like it was sport. She walked into the room slowly, eyes scanning the walls lined with student artwork and progress boards. Her son trailed behind her, more relaxed than I remembered, humming to himself, utterly unfazed. We made eye contact. She hesitated. I could see her trying to decide how to approach me. Whether to ignore the past or acknowledge it. Whether I would bring it up or pretend not to remember. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I waited. She finally walked over. Her voice was softer than I remembered, but still careful. She introduced herself again unnecessarily and thanked me for the incredible job we were doing here. Her son had flourished, she said. He was engaged, expressive, even helping his younger sister with her reading now. She looked me in the eye and added, "It's changed our whole family dynamic." I told her I was glad. She cleared her throat. Then came the line I didn't expect but also somehow knew was coming. "I didn't know back then," she said. "I didn't know what you were capable of." I held her gaze for a long moment, not cold, not cruel, just steady. "It's not about what I was capable of," I said gently. "It's about what you couldn't imagine." She blinked. Not offended, just stunned. She nodded, slowly, like someone accepting terms they couldn't change. I turned to her son and asked how he was enjoying music class. His face lit up. He told me about the song they were composing, how he got to choose the instruments, how his teacher said he had an ear for rhythm. I listened closely, asked a few questions, and let him talk himself breathless. When he ran off to join a group of kids at the snack table, his mother lingered. I could feel the apology forming, but I didn't need it. The room around us was enough. The laughter, the open conversations between teachers and families, the freedom. This was my answer to every time I'd been overlooked, dismissed, patronized. I didn't need to correct the past. I had rewritten the future. And the best part was, it wasn't just mine. It belonged to every child who now walked into school knowing they mattered. Every teacher who felt seen in their own profession. Every parent who realized learning could be joyful instead of transactional. By the end of the night, the hallways were quiet again. I walked through each classroom, collecting papers left behind, turning off lights. In the main office, the wall where we kept student thank you notes had grown full. I stared at them for a moment. One stood out, written in purple crayon, lopsided and full of joy. "I love school because it lets me be me." No score, no grade, just truth. And that was worth every quiet night spent dreaming, every insult swallowed, every moment spent invisible. Because now I was unmistakably seen, not as a helper, not as a staff member, not as just the nanny, but as the woman who built the place they never believed I could.